Taiwan with Chiang Kai-shek, but that's what happened. The conference ended. Roosevelt goes back to the United States. The war goes on. But there was still this debate between the Army and the Navy, should we attack Formosa? Roosevelt was at the 1944 Democratic Convention, where he was nominated for a 4th term in office. He left that convention early to go to Hawaii to meet with the Army and the Navy and make a decision on the invasion of Formosa. Left the convention early. At that time, Roosevelt's vice president was named Henry Wallace. Henry Wallace would later run for president in 1948 himself. Henry Wallace was basically a socialist. And Roosevelt had decided he no longer wanted Henry Wallace as his vice president. So at the convention in 1944, July 1944, just before Roosevelt went to Hawaii to decide about the invasion of Formosa, he named Harry Truman to be his vice president. Harry Truman was probably the least prepared president that this country has ever had. He never went to college. He was a failed businessman. He was a small-town politician from Kansas City, Missouri, that came out of a corrupt political machine. His worldview was very narrow and didn't extend outside Missouri. While Harry Truman was vice president, he did not even know the United States was developing an atomic bomb. It wasn't until Harry Truman became president that he was told, oh, by the way, Mr. President, we've got this bomb we've been making. Harry Truman probably couldn't have found Formosa on a map. Nobody was telling him anything, including Roosevelt. Harry Truman complained later in life that Roosevelt really only spoke to him 3 times after he was named as vice president, and they were short conversations. Back to the convention. Roosevelt, after naming Harry Truman as his vice president, goes to Hawaii, listens to Admiral Nimitz of the Navy, listens to General MacArthur, and decides we'll attack Okinawa, we'll attack the Philippines, and we will not attack Formosa. Then Roosevelt returned, died within a year. Harry Truman is now put in office, knowing absolutely nothing about Formosa. Harry Truman is confronted with the decision of the atomic bomb. Everybody says, well, Harry Truman decided to drop the atomic bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. He didn't really make that decision. He decided when to drop it, but the decision to go ahead and use these weapons had already been made by the military planners. And Harry Truman didn't want to go against the planners. There's a war being going on. He wasn't prepared to fight. He did what he was told. And the decision was made to drop the bomb, and the war ended. There was much planning at that point done very quickly on what to do about the surrendering Japanese. The Japanese were on islands all throughout the Pacific. They were scattered all through China, Manchuria, Burma, everywhere. And it was a major task to try to get American troops in place to accept the surrender. Chiang Kai-shek said, well, I'll help, and wanted very much to accept the surrender of the Japanese in Hong Kong. But the British would have no part of that. They said, we will accept the surrender. The Russians were advancing. The Russians were still moving in gaining ground. We were very much concerned that the Russians were going to take the entire Korean peninsula. A decision had to be made quickly on who was going to take the surrendering prisoners where. So late one night, August 10th, 1945, a tired and overworked Army colonel by the name of Charles Bonesteel was told, prepare an order for General MacArthur on the surrendering Japanese armies. Figure out who's going to surrender where. Bonesteel, working in his office with poor maps, spent most of his time trying to figure out what to do about Korea. Spent very little time thinking about Formosa. On Korea, he had a map from National Geographic. That's all he had to work with. He noticed that there was the 38th parallel. He thought, well, maybe that would be a good line. And that became the dividing line between North and South Korea. A disastrous decision for the country. It harmed the economy in both North and South Korea. The 38th parallel was an imaginary line. Did not respect the mountains, did not respect the rivers, did not respect the roads, did not respect the political boundaries, and it immediately created a problem. But the Russians agreed with it, and that's all that they really cared about, is stopping the Russian advance, because they were afraid the Russians would take the whole peninsula. But Colonel Bonesteel had to prepare a plan for everywhere. So as he went down his list, he came to Formosa. He knew there was no American troops on Formosa. He knew that we were spending troops here and there, and that there was an urge to get troops back to America. So Bonesteel remembered, the Cairo Declaration. We'll have Chiang Kai-shek do it. He's fighting the communists. This will help him out. Chiang Kai-shek, well, I said, I have no way to get my troops to to Formosa. I'll need help. So the U.S. Navy, the 7th Fleet, landed Chinese troops on Formosa on October 25th, 1945. The day before, the United Nations came into being, October 24th. And China was made a member of the Security Council of the brand new United Nations. If the United Nations were to be asked about the future of Formosa at that time, and since, China would have veto power. So the coincidence of the dates is unfortunately very accidentally significant to the fate of Taiwan. When the Chinese troops arrived on October 25th, they didn't even want to go ashore. They'd heard rumors about Japanese hiding in the hills waiting for them, and they refused to get out of the landing craft. The American sailors were furious at them. There were almost fights on the ships, and finally the Chinese were put ashore. The Taiwanese population witnessed this, and that immediately created an ugly climate between the Chinese troops and the people of Formosa. An ugly climate that was exaggerated by the Japanese language being spoken in the island because it had been a colony for 50 years. And the battle-hardened troops that Chiang Kai-shek had sent on American ships to Formosa viewed the Formosans as Japanese and were not kind and gentle. They processed the surrender of the Japanese soldiers. Let me check my notes and see what I've left out here. So that was October 1945. The Chinese Civil War is still going on. President Truman said to General George Marshall, see if you can't make some peace in China. See if you can't stop the fighting. And Marshall tried. And he had worked out a tentative peace between Mao and Chiang. But it fell apart. And in 1946, the fighting intensified. Chiang started losing ground to Mao's forces. And Truman made a speech about that. And I want to read a little about what Harry Truman said about the Chinese Civil War. This is Harry Truman. The Marshall Mission had been unable to produce results because the government of Chiang Kai-shek did not command the respect and support of the Chinese people. Chiang was defeated by a loss of support by his own people and by American arms, as many of his own generals took their armies, equipped with our aid, into the enemy camp. It was when that sort of surrender began to occur on a large scale, I decided to cut off further shipments to China. George Kennan, an American diplomat, told the Secretary of State, Dean Acheson, he recommended that the United States run the Chinese off the island. Acheson replied, he said, well, I don't care if there's an uprising. Maybe we should support a Taiwanese uprising. But Truman wouldn't listen. And they were not making formal recommendations. It was talk. This is the type of consideration the United States government was giving to the Formosa situation. And never once during this time was there any consideration over the self-determination of the people of Taiwan. After the Japanese surrender, many on the island were looking for the United States to offer them a chance to choose their own path in the world, to choose for themselves what future government they wanted. And instead they got an occupation army. An occupation army that was corrupt and cruel. February 28th, 1947. I don't need to tell anyone in this room the significance of that date. If I was talking somewhere else in Los Angeles to a different audience, probably no one in the room would know that date. Until January of this year, I did not know anything about 228. It was not taught to me in school, it wasn't in my textbooks, and I didn't learn about it in the news. I suppose if I'd sought it out, I would have discovered it, but it was not taught to me. When I learned about 228 in January, I was astounded. I couldn't believe it. And I began a very detailed search and study of American history from that point on to see exactly what we had done to the people of Taiwan with our ignorance and our accident and our disregard for the human rights of the people. Well, what was Harry Truman doing? George Kerr, in his book Formosa Betrayed, talks about sending daily cables telling about the bloodshed going on. Kerr said the bodies are piling up on the roadways. They're piling up on the riverbanks. They're floating in the harbors. I've seen men being led past our council office to their death. Kerr went out when he saw several young men being led with wire wrapped around their throats at a gunpoint. And he went out to see what possibly thing he could do, just shocked. And the Chinese nationalist soldier leading these young